Welcome back to Big Mouth, and remember you can follow me on Twitter at Movies TV Mad. For absolute years, generations, we have been begging WB to form a DC Studios. With new ownership of Warner Media, this is a remarkable possibility now, and so much potential in doing this. The problem is you can't just form a DC Studios and go, look, we got DC Studios. You have to have the right person running it. But I think we have to go beyond just one studio. I think we need to do something a bit more ambitious here. What I would do, I would form DC Studios, DC Elseworlds, and DC Black Label. Each one of these studios would have a head. Well, when I say head, a person who's in charge of it, not just a head like Futurama, right? So you could, what I would do is I would appoint someone who knows the comic books that he or she or they or whoever would be making movies about. So I would like someone maybe who is involved in DC Comics, but also has shown that he has the gifts to produce movies. So at DC Comics, I would put that person in charge. And then DC Elseworlds, I would look at people who have written Elseworlds comics before, but would have the talent to produce DC Elseworld films. And again, DC Black Label. I would put someone in charge who maybe understands the Black Label, understands what that would take. Maybe you could even put Todd Phillips in charge of DC Black Label. He did such a good job with the first movie, but is he capable of doing more? He doesn't really know these characters, so that would be a problem for me. So what I would like to see is comic book people who have the talent to produce films in charge of these three studios. And I mean, comment down below. Let me know what kind of names you would put in charge of these three studios. Now, three studios seems like a lot, but you don't want to put one person in charge of DC Studios and give them this job to do, because I do think we need Elseworld movies and Black Label movies. I think that's important. And so DC Studios would be the mainstream DC movies. So you put someone in charge who would know how to do that. Who's written, maybe been the editor of DC Comics and been able to bring these, these mainstream kind of titles that bring kind of a mainstream audience and a broad audience to the play. And so it's not necessarily important that they've written comics, but that they know these characters and are able to produce movies and can lead it. So that's what I would do with DC Comics, or DC Studios, should I say. And then, again, the same thing with DC Elseworlds, just someone who can bring this together. And I wouldn't necessarily put big-time producers in charge of these who know nothing about comics. There's two things we need here, and this is pretty obvious. DC scripted content needs to move away from the WB trademark, and it needs its own studio. I think that's part of the problem, because people don't trust one WB. And I know different people have led it in different eras, so that's not really fair in terms of DC scripted content. But it's just the way that it is. How many times have we heard, oh, WB's messed another DC movie up again? Happens all the time. The bad reputation is there. So that's one thing. And I also feel that we can't have big name producers like J.J. Abrams running a DC Studios, because he doesn't know much about comics. He knows how to make a movie and produce a movie, but that's not good enough. Too many of these films move away from what makes these characters and these graphic novels so successful and beloved. So we need people who bleed comic books and superheroes, right? We need people, where this matters. And so at the end of the day, Kevin Feige is stroke a comic book man, but he's also a producer with a producer's mentality, right? And producers speak, but he loves the comics. He loves the Marvel comics. That's why that works. He's a rarity. He's unique. There's not many people like him around. So there's no point trying to find another Kevin Feige. I wouldn't even want that anyway. But you need to find someone who cares about these characters, but can actually produce content. And that's very difficult. We're talking about 3 studios here. It would be a very ambitious plan. Now, if you're asking me, could we just cut the DC Elseworld studio and the DC Black Label studio? We could easily do that and brand it all in. But it's a bit messy, because DC's a bit more difficult to brand in one studio. It's not like Marvel. For example, they've got an issue with Deadpool, Marvel Studios, right now. That's going to be R-rated, but they've made it clear no more films will be R-rated. But if you could create a new Marvel studio, a Marvel R-rated studio, because there's an audience for that type of thing, then I think people would be very, very happy with them. How long can they carry on just being mainstream? And I think by having a DC Studios, a DC Elseworld Studios, and a DC Black Label Studio, you can do whatever you want. You can have the mainstream light stuff that people watch and enjoy, and it's great, but then you can have the darker stuff with DC Black Label, right? Make them all R-rated. And then DC Elseworlds, you can create all these Elseworld character situations where they're nothing like what they are in the central universe. So it's a broad stroke. And I think if the DCEU started with this kind of a vision, I think we would be in a different place right now. But what do you think about all of this? Would you like to see 3 different DC Studios, DC Elseworld Studios, and DC Black Label? Do you think this is a good idea from me? Or do you think it's a load of crap? You can be honest as long as you're constructive and nice. Comment down below, like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you tonight on Big Mouth Live from 6 p.m. UK time. Until then, goodbye.